my first time ever coming to a cidery, a hard cidery, ever. And I'm not kidding about it. So I'm from New England originally, like so New York, but not New York. Thank you, yeah. So apple cider, you know, there's a lot of cider mills. So when you're a kid, you know, before puberty ruins everything, you go and when we go to cider mills, I remember that as a kid, we'd go to cider mills and watch people press cider, and then, you know, you could get hard cider, but not professional. You get it from like Chuck, who lives next door. Goes down and you go, you know, this is the new batch here. The dog got into it. He's blind, so that's how you know it's a good one. But that was my experience with cider prior to today. So I'm glad to, you know. Anyway, I also want to thank Riley for teeing me up with that. You know, what's the most interesting thing you've ever found in archaeology? Because that's kind of the theme that I'm going to work on here too. But it goes in a slightly different direction. There aren't any bombs that I know of. But we start with a premise, and speaking of the silliest questions that we as archaeologists get asked over and over and over again, this is such a common question that this is actually a t-shirt. I stole this from a t-shirt. That's a t-shirt. But wear that. Archaeologists do not dig dinosaurs. Archaeologists, as Riley pointed out, dig sometimes, but very rarely do we dig anything, but we don't dig dinosaurs. Just try to, you know, beat that into your head as hard as you can. When I tell you that the coolest thing that I've ever found in archaeology will eventually come back to dinosaurs. Which proves, if nothing else, that archaeologists are a bunch of damn liars. My specialty, by the way, I'm a Bears Ears archaeologist. I'm trained throughout the Intermountain West. Thank you. Don't ask questions that are too controversial. Increasingly, I do a lot of research in the Grand Staircase and the Grand Canyon areas, and all three of those are going to come up over time. But the main thing that I want to share with you, the coolest thing I've found as an archaeologist is very recently, has to do with the indigenous community, Native American paleontology specifically, which I didn't even know was a thing. And now it's become an obsession of mine, and it's something that hasn't gotten enough attention. It's something that I'm researching now as we go. I've got one paper coming out, and I present this to people. I just talked down south in Kanab, and everyone went, "What are you talking about?" So here's what I'm talking about. The field of archaeology in America has had what I should very gently call a spotted or troubled history vis-a-vis the Native American community. Archaeology, if you don't already know, is a subset or a subfield of the field of anthropology, which is the study of all things human history, human behavior, human societies. It's the study of humans. And archaeology is anthropology pitched backwards. And one of my favorite descriptors of the early sort of formative days of archaeology in the United States of America comes from a scholar, Lakota scholar, actually Standing Rock Lakota scholar, named Vine Deloria Jr., who said that you can tell when summer has returned to the land of his ancestors and his people, because the leaves turn green and the flowers bloom and hordes of locusts move into the landscape with clipboards in their hands and microphones sticking them in people's faces, and they're called anthropologists. And they come and they take 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 and they take, and then you get to the end of the season, they're gone, they go publish something somewhere very arcane, jargonized, that nobody ever gets to see. Times have changed. This is my friend Heidi Roberts is behind the camera. This was down in the Kanab area. These are a couple of individuals from the Southern Paiute tribe. Even just 20 years ago, this would have been unheard of. Prior to which, and especially getting back into the late 1800s, and this is a picture from the Bears Ears area. You'll see another one in just a moment. Archaeologists really were basically looters. What we did as a science, the science end of archaeology didn't really come into its own until starting tentatively in the very late 18 and early 1900s, with people realizing that if something's below something else, it's older, which shouldn't have taken that long to figure out. And the Zuni figured that out. I'll get back to that. But they were really, they would go, they'd say, okay, this is a treasure. They were looking for treasure. So the Indiana Jones myth is based on a reality that we've been trying to stomp out for about 150 years. But it started like this. And this is the site that these folks, this was Richard Wetherill in 1894, this is the site that they were excavating, and this is the sort of science that was taking place in the 1890s. And as I started to intone with that first slide, one of the things that we have really come into as a science in archaeology in North America is working with and articulating with the indigenous community and involving Native American folks and actually realizing that traditional cultural knowledge is just as important as science to understand North America. But to get there, one of the things that we have to do, in addition to moving forward, is try to correct some of those mistakes from the past. And that's where I introduced my friend Lori Webster, who got a pile of money from the Canyonlands Natural History Association to go, I'm not kidding about this, to go to museums, to go and look at all these things that were dug up 100, 150 years ago, play with them, take photos, geek out, and then move on to the next one. And I don't know how you pull off a magic trick like that. I don't. I've always said to people, people ask me, what do you do as an archaeologist? I say, well, I try to do whatever I want, frankly. Like, it comes down to that happiness in life is find what you want to do and then find some sucker to pay you to do it. And that's archaeology too. But Lori has really hit the jackpot. So what she's looking at here, this is Basket Maker 2. This is a yucca weave, what do they call it? Carrying bag, burden bag, and inside that, believe it or not, that's a cornmeal from 1,500 years ago. And on that note, Lori, so she, she's going and looking at these things that were, because in the past, when Wetherill and his gang, when they were digging these things up, the notes, quote unquote, would be like pot in alcove, ship it off, and then like skull found somewhere. And you know what I mean? It took them 100 years to re-find that site because they lost the map. So for people like Lori Webster, she works with a dude named Chuck LaRue, and then this fellow from the Pueblo of, I think, Jemez, to try to understand what these things are, characterize them, describe them, and then either repatriate them to the tribes, or if the tribes don't want them, leave them in the museum. And thus she came upon a curious, what's going on here? Artifact. This isn't working right now. Justice is a big help. Perfect. Thank you, Justice. So now I get to see what everyone's going to say. And thus they came upon this. So this was excavated by Wetherill, by Richard Wetherill in the 1890s at a basket maker site. So that's, again, about 1,500 years ago. It's a horn. It's just a horn. Found at the site, dug it up. Obviously, Wetherill's this early kind of looter archaeologist, went horn and stuck it in a box, and that was the end of it. But Chuck LaRue, this guy that works with Dr. Webster, along with the Pueblos in northern Arizona, is just a whiz. He's a whiz at identifying very old, long dead animals. He once found, when they were looking at a blanket, a feather blanket, he identified 120 different species of bird by the feathers that were, so about 10,000 feathers were woven into this blanket. He found 120. I don't know how he does it. But he identified this. And what he realized is that this is the horn, in this archaeological context, of a type of mountain goat that's been extinct for 1,300 years. 13,000 years. So long before anybody was living in the Southwest, long before especially anybody who was living at the Grand Canyon, which is where these things live, is Harrington's mountain goat. And this was found in the Bears Ears area. This was found in Cedar Mesa. And the reason that's interesting is because these things never lived there. Never. Nowhere near there. But we do know they were living at the Grand Canyon, and we know that people at the Grand Canyon, thanks to Hopi informants and thanks to archaeologists working for the Park Service, know that in the late Archaic, so this is about 4,000 years ago, folks were looking for caves that had the fossils of this long dead mountain goat in it, and they were twisting up these little things here, split twig figurines, and leaving them there as offerings or building them into altars. So what these folks were doing, so far as we know, is they were trying to find these caves, looking for something they knew was long gone. The fact that it was, thousands and thousands of years before they showed up, and leaving, offerings to whatever they thought it was. So we don't know what they thought, but we know that it was extremely important to them, that they were essentially practicing a form of paleontology, that they worshipped or in some way articulated with these fossils. And that's where they dragged me into this. And because I've never found a split twig figurine ever in my life. I know how to make them. I had a couple of friends that teach me how to make them. But I did find this, thanks to my friend Tim Peterson at Grand Canyon Trust. Those, if you can't see, are rock art split twig figurines. That's located in a canyon about a third of the way between Grand Gulch, so between the Bears Ears area and Grand Canyon. So the story that this tells is that these folks, as a paleontologist named Othniel Marsh once said, we do not have a monopoly on an obsession with history. The people of history were just as interested in history as we are interested in theirs. And it kicked open a door that a friend of mine, Lyle Belenqua, who's a Hopi archaeologist, just kicked me essentially and said, you need to investigate this, because there is paleontology in Native American stories, creation stories, narratives that nobody talks about that could be of tremendous use to your science and other people's science. And just summer before last, this was brought home to us in a really interesting way. This, if you can't tell, is a Clovis point. Dates to about roughly 12,000 years ago. Was found on top of Cedar Mesa. This is down in the Bears Ears area too. So about 12,000 years later than it should have been. And this particular type of chert, this particular type of stone, it kind of has this like tiger stripe pattern, like if a tiger was made out of like ice cream instead of murder. And it's very distinct. That's how you draw a tiger, by the way. It's start with orange, and then add stripes and murder. But you can tell it's a very distinctive type of stone, and you can they can use special science and technology, trace element analysis especially, to tell where it's from. And it came from Texas. So about 12,000 years late, and many thousands of miles away from where it should have been. And the person that found it was a school teacher named Rachel, who did the right thing, which was, of course, freak out, but then leave it exactly where it was. Took a photo, got a GPS point, told my friend Don Simonis and the BLM, who went, and they investigated it, studied it. Now now we know, where it came from. But it was in this site, this Pueblo site. So the ancestors to the Hopi and the Zuni, it was in, have nothing to do with Clovis. Again, 10,000 or 12,000 years later, and 2, 3, 4,000, I don't know how many thousand miles away from the Texas-Oklahoma border. So what was it doing there? And the only answer, and this is especially the answer, favored by the tribes, by the folks that are the ancestors to these people, is that they loved the past. That they were just as into the past as we were, and we can find them curating, and we can find them studying the past. And they've got some great tales to tell about it. This is a site. As you can see, those are not human prints. This is down in the Grand Staircase area. And at this particular site, as you can see, these are, what are they called? Growliter, three-toed dinosaurs. Leading, they're about this big. There's no scale, so, this big. And they're leading toward the edge of this cliff, and it looks like they go cliff, and then off the cliff. And if you were to try to read that and interpret it, that's what you would think. This is where something went and off. And if you do, and don't literally do this, but if you were to figuratively leap off that cliff, which is to say scramble down, turn around, get on the bottom of the cliff looking back this way. So you're at the bottom, you're looking back at the cliff face toward where these things are, you find this. And this is probably the coolest quote-unquote thing I've found in archaeology. This and the stories attached to it. If you look all the way over on the left, dinosaur track. If you look on the right and up in the center, you see these hominid figures are kind of doing this the way that they did, And everything in between, it's almost like they're looking at like an evolution between. There's a dinosaur track, there's a human, there's something in between. It's the story itself, the stories, I should say, themselves are lost to us. We can get hints if you're nice to people in the indigenous community and you work with them, and they'll tell you, like my friend Lyle Belenqua, the Hopi archaeologist, has some great stories about it. But we don't know exactly what these folks that made this, 800-900 years ago were thinking, but we do know that they were thinking that it was something really important and really powerful, and that it was something really, really, integral to what they were doing there and how they were articulating that landscape. And let me go back real quick. So a friend of mine, an author in Flagstaff, Arizona, named Scott Thibany, had the good luck to go out there with this other guy, Chuck LaRue, the guy that identified the horn, along with some folks from the Navajo Nation, some Diné guys, and they said, "Oh, we can estimate, that this creature was about this big." They estimated the weight, they estimated how fast it was, based on the fact that they're hunters and they look at tracks all the time. And then that's what they do. They can tell the animal's this big, it's going that way, it was moving this fast along the landscape, and that's how they hunt. Scott expressed a little bit of doubt. This was about 10 years ago. Subsequently went and spoke with some of the paleontologists down there in that area and asked them, what he had heard from these Navajo folks, these Diné guys, saying that they can estimate things about these dinosaurs in this stone. And he goes, "Oh yeah, they're about dead on." Apparently they find dinosaur tracks like this all the time in the Navajo Nation, and this has been a running theme. The paleontologist will use a whole bunch of science and clever high-tech math and burning piles of grant money and come up with their estimates, and it's all sort of computer modeled, and there's an over and under, and it's statistical and all that stuff, and then they'll turn and the Navajos will say, "Well, if I was hunting this animal, it's probably about this big and moving that fast," and they're always just dead on. It's crazy. So again, really useful information. Like, you actually talk to these folks, they know some stuff. And so that then led me back in that full circle. Like, if we as archaeologists, after all this years and all this time thinking about the fact that the folks that we're studying in their history, like, this is native, this is North America. They've been here a lot longer than us. They've been looking at this stuff and thinking about this stuff and articulating with this stuff a hell of a lot longer than we do or have. Maybe ask, see what they have to offer, and so this is, and it's brand new. Like I said, this is new, a new field of study. The study of the paleontology of indigenous people is something that's like really has popped up once or twice in the late 1800s, and then it just went away. But it's of tremendous value. I just wanted to show you this, what sort of a landscape usage story this paints for myself and for my research team. Here's these split-twigged figurines down here in the Grand Canyon. Here's where we found that thing. Here's bear's ears. Here's the goat horn from, here. And it just tells the story of migration going all the way across the land. And I don't have any slides for this. You're gonna have to use your imaginations because it was too recently. But the latest iteration of this story, I love it. 1872. A couple of folks from Yale University, Othniel Marsh, who was an old legendary paleontologist, and a guy by the name of, I can't remember, Cope. So Marsh and Cope, 1872, went out to Utah, to northeastern Utah. They went to the Uinta Basin, where they met up with some Ute folks. Now the Utes are obsessed with trilobites. They look like little armored monsters, basically. And so they used to go and harvest trilobite fossils. You find trilobite rock art, and they used them as protective amulets. So these folks were interested in A, what do they know about fossils, B, where do they find them, and all this other stuff. And Marsh and Cope were led to this place where they subsequently found the Pleistocene rhinos, the woolly rhinos that we were talking about earlier. Fast forward to a week and a half ago, and I and a team from SWCA are out in the Uinta Basin, and we're doing some pedestrian inventory ahead of this big project that's going in out there. And we're walking along, and one of my team members goes, "I found some bones." And I went, "Shit." Because bones are a nightmare. If you're an archaeologist, because we're trying not to be colonialistic anymore, and because archaeologists try to be respectful, if you find bones, and especially if you know they're human bones, everything stops. The agencies come in, and the tribes are consulted, and money gets, it's complicated because you want to be respectful, and it can really hold up a project, and I apparently am notorious for it. So I was like, no, I don't want to deal with it. So I went over and I looked at them, and they're stone bones, it turns out. They're bones and teeth, they're made out of stone, so we don't have to deal with that. But we hadn't found up to that point. So Eocene fossils, like the time that everything was covered in water, rhinos, that kind of thing. So post-dinosaur, but way pre-us. And we hadn't found anything archaeological. We hadn't found anything cultural yet. And then we were scrambling up, we found all these bones. And right up on the top of this hill where they were, there was what's called a hammerstone. It looks approximately like this. Made out of quartzite, battering on one side. It's what you would use to like make, slam against another stone and you make like an axe head or something, stone tools. One of those, just sitting up on top, whole bunch of bones, hammerstone, whole bunch of bones. And I kept thinking about this story about Marsh and Cope in 1872. This is where the Native Americans that have been living there for thousands of years were quarrying dinosaurs. They were quarrying fossils, doing paleontological work. So we found a living example, maybe, had found a living example of the archaeology of paleontology. Recently enough that I couldn't get the slides into the talk. So, and the more, without dragging this out too much longer, because I know that there's more music to be heard and there's probably going to be questions, but the more that I look into this, the more that I talk to folks at Hopi and Zuni, there's just there's a world of information. And some of the coolest stories I've ever heard, the creation stories these folks use, the Zuni people go and dig and harvest for clays to make pottery, and then pots or stones to use as tempers in the clays. They dig for things like mica, so they dig. Think of them as the dwarves of the Pueblo world. And the Zunis, understanding the fact that old things are at the bottom and then they get a little younger. And again, I don't know why it took us until the 1850s to figure that out, but it's the simplest science experiment you can do. Do it in your own home. Get a thing, put a thing on the table, put another thing on top of that thing, put another thing on top of that thing, and then put a fourth thing on top of that thing, and then get your child and go, child, what was put there first? And if they don't point to the bottom one, then call a doctor. So the Zuni knew this. They figured this out. And they look all the way down, the deepest they would see, it just looks like chaos and miasma, and then suddenly there's a bunch of crinoids and shells and fins and things that look really marine. Then on top of that, there's bones with joints and stuff with dinosaurs. And then on top of that's a bunch of sandstone. And then standing on top of that is the Zuni. And so how do you think they interpreted it? The world was, chaos, and then they built the world, and then it was a bunch of water, and then something came along and cleared that out, and there was all these monsters all over the place. And something got rid of the monsters, and they were actually telling stories about a comet, if you can believe this, 1,000 years ago at the Pueblo of Zuni, something that wiped them all out to make way for us, for humans. Eerily close to, to the geological record. So, and that's one, and there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these sorts of stories. So that's the coolest thing I've found as an archaeologist, is that the science, what we use as scientists, the data that we use, the way that we derive it, as humanistic scientists, we as anthropologists and we as archaeologists are in the unique position of bridging gaps and bringing worlds together and bringing stories that, as Riley actually set me up for earlier, stories from people that haven't been heard, that have been underrepresented, maybe some that are right here and have stories about other sciences. If it works for us, why not others? Why not paleontology? Why not biology? Why stop there? So now it's my turn. These folks helped. Does anyone have any questions for me specifically? Justice, by the way, this helped a lot. I can't point at anything, but there's nothing else to point at, so it doesn't matter. Somebody, yeah, right here. Did everybody hear that? So what he asked was, given the fact that I and my colleagues, work so closely with the indigenous community here and abroad, abroad meaning, Southwest, where you're abroad even if you're a guy. It's, and his question was, do you find many examples of animals that have been utilized or processed, right? Two answers. One, yes, lots. Two, there's a whole science devoted to it. That would be zoology, or zooarchaeology. It's the study of people's use of animals, looking at like assemblages of animal bones through time. So if you find, for example, if you find that, again, old things are in the bottom. If you find a bunch of like deer and then right above that there's no deer but there's a bunch of rabbits and then right above that everybody's gone, you can tell that like something, either they killed off the deer or the climate changed, and you can reconstruct, you know, things like climate changes, things like resource depression and so on. Probably the best school for the study of zooarchaeology that I know about is the University of Utah. Their archaeology department's got a fantastic, boy, the bones. My God, the bones. You go in there and there's bones and there's more bones. And our friend Katie Molinoff, who's out in the field right now, just finally finished a PhD. It took her about 6 years. She counted, and I'm not kidding about this, 10,000 fish looking at the skeletons. So in fact, tens of thousands of fish skeletons to figure out, you know, moving dietary trends when people were on the coast and the lake and coast and back and forth in the Pacific Northwest. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of bones. So yeah, it's a big part of what we do. And talking, that's another one where, you know, talking to them, talking to the folks that are alive right now, this is their cultural memory. It can really help. Like, we found this, I'm not sure what it is. Do you have any idea? And it can be, you know, tremendously helpful in trying to answer those questions. Again, everybody hear that? Okay, so I'll repeat it. If anybody can't hear, I'll repeat. What Audrey was asking was, I pointed out the fact that in the past, and to a certain extent right up to the present, that archaeologists and Native Americans haven't had the most comfortable relationship for reasons that, I don't know, I hope I don't need to get into. But people don't like to be treated like things. They just don't. They don't like to be treated like data points. They like to be treated like people. And I don't know why that took so long to figure out either, but it's the weirdest. But anyway, but she was asking, you know, what things do we as archaeologists, or what things are the archaeological community doing to try and bridge that gap and try to make that relationship more comfortable. In a broad sense, if I thought real hard, I could probably repeat something or other from some textbook somewhere that satisfies that question, but I've never really had much faith in such things. Instead, I work in, you know, all across the Intermountain West for my employer, for SWCA. Where I do my research and where I do all my conservation work is Bears Ears. And what we're doing there is just, you know, kicking down the door and inviting everyone to the table. And that's what we're doing. It's, you know, with Northern Arizona University, just to the south, where my friend Lyle, who I've mentioned way too many times now, but my friend Lyle, who's from Hopi, went there, got a master's degree in archaeology because he wanted to know more about his history. And was welcome and wasn't told, you know, no, this is all just for white people, it's science, you don't belong here, you know. And, you know, tearing down that sort of expectation. My buddy Jason Nez is a Navajo archaeologist from Northern Arizona. I've got another friend, Lloyd Masayemtua, who has done a bunch of work with myself. He's now the superintendent, ironically, of Navajo National Monument. He's Hopi, that's the irony. Also has a master's in archaeology. So just inviting, and just saying things like, you know, we want to understand, we as anthropologists, as archaeologists, we want to understand the human condition. We want to understand how it looks in the modern world and how it extends backwards in time. We're curious about that stuff. We can bring the science. We as scientists, we can bring the privilege, and we can bring, you know, the institutions. They can bring traditional cultural knowledge. They can bring historical knowledge. We don't have that. At the same time, for the most part, these communities, they don't have what we've got. They don't have the access to technology. They don't have the privilege that, you know, that we enjoy. So bringing both of those elements to the table. I'll try to keep this as short as possible, but by way of capping that off with another story, I'll tell you this real quick anecdote. I had the privilege last October of leading a hike. I was asked by Friends of Cedar Mesa down in Bears Ears to lead a hike. These paying clients to go and visit these archaeological sites, there's cliff dwellings and rock art and stuff. Bears Ears, you know what I mean, Bears Ears. And so they had me along. I'm the archaeologist, I'm the specialist, I know things. And the guy driving the van was a Diné individual, Navajo from Bluff named Lewis. And he's a very personable guy. And so we get out, we're going to these sites, and I insisted that Lewis come with us, and he was excited, you know, because he never gets to talk to big crowds, and he's a ham. So we go and we found this, we go to this site, this rock art site, and it depicts, there's a whole bunch of sheep, a whole bunch of bighorn sheep. They're like a big cloud of bighorn sheep, and then right over here on the side of the bighorn sheep is this one bighorn sheep with a human figure kind of sticking up out of the top of it. So human figure down to here, no legs, bighorn sheep. Picture that. And of course these people, these paying clients, like, oh, it looks like they were riding on a sheep. Were they riding on sheep? The people, I don't think you can ride on a sheep, you know. And FCM, and they pointed to me and they said, okay, archaeologist, this is your, you know, do it. And I said, all right, well, and so I kind of just queued up the standard science. Well, we're scientists. We weren't there. Symbols are culturally contingent. You know, the one that I always go back to is Smokey the Bear. If you were from another culture or another planet, you come here, you see a bear with a hat and a shovel, you wouldn't think fire. You know, you'd think these people worship bears. You wouldn't leap to like wildfire prevention. You know what I mean? You need to know the definition of the symbol in order to know what the symbol stands for. And they all can, oh yes, oh, right, that makes sense, you know. And then I turned to Lewis and said, Lewis, what do you think? You know, what's your take on this? And Lewis goes, well, it was only last weekend I had the privilege of taking my own family to go hunting, because you can still hunt, especially if you're Navajo, for bighorn sheep just over the border in the San Juan Mountains. And he led some of his family out there, you know, to go hunting for these bighorn. And he says, you know, indigenous people, especially us, the Diné, we don't hunt the way white people do. We don't we don't build a tree house and then sit up there smoking cigarettes and farting and waiting for the stupidest deer in the world to wander by and eat, which I used to do with my dad, by the way, so I know what he's talking about. And, well, he said, you know, what we do, like, we're more, you gotta get into the spirit of it, you gotta get into the woods, you gotta get into the animal. And he starts pantomiming this thing, you know, and he's like walking, he's like, you gotta get into the prey, get into the mind of it, and get into the spirit. You're not gonna talk, you're kind of walking on, he puts his head down and he hears a noise, you know, he's going to eat some more grass. And he says the way he's describing this is you got to really get into the spirit of the animal, which from a scientific point of view makes a lot of sense. If you're psychologically, if you want to go out and have a successful hunt, thinking like and moving like the prey that you're going after is a real good way to find them. And so it just makes total logical sense to me, but I'd never thought of it that way. And there's Lewis acting like a bighorn sheep out in front of us. And so then he gets up finally and he points, he goes, so what I see here is a whole bunch of bighorn sheep, and I see this one individual who's gotten totally into the spirit of the sheep. And that's why he's half sheep and half human. And that means he's gonna have a successful hunt. And every single one of us, including me, look back, son of a bitch. That is exactly what it looks like. I never would have, and I'm a scientist, and far be it from me to talk shit about something, but never in a million years would I have thought of that. All the scientific training in the world, I never would have thought of that. The culture itself, that's the knowledge that it provides. And so we were all able to stand there and go, oh, now I get it. And never would we have been able to have that opportunity otherwise. So that mainly is just saying, what's your take? What do you have to offer? And then actually listening. And that's the way it happens.
Thank you. Let's give one more big hand to Ralph and Riley. Thank you, Mountain West. Thank you for all of you, because without you all, we wouldn't have Science on Tap. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Last but not least, be kind to your servers. They've worked very hard to serve us all the day. Have another cider and stay for the second set of the quartet. We'll have a vocalist. And also, we are a local nonprofit. We do have some swag available for some donations if you're so inclined to get a cool t-shirt. Yes?
That swag will exist in the archaeological record. It's a deal.
You must worship tardigrades. So again, thank you everyone. Have a great night.